The church didn't fall apart because of one man, it collapsed because no one questioned him. For much of the 20th century, Father Marcial Maciel Degollado was treated as one of the most powerful priests in the Catholic world. He was not assigned quietly to parishes or moved discreetly between dioceses. He was celebrated, praised, protected at the highest levels of the church. Maciel was the founder of the Legionaries of Christ, a wealthy and influential religious order known for discipline, obedience, and loyalty to Rome. He built schools, seminaries, and universities. He cultivated relationships with politicians, business leaders, and senior Vatican officials. To supporters, he was a model of devotion. To the church, he was a valuable asset. To his victims, he was a predator shielded by power. Maciel founded the Legionaries in 1941 in Mexico. From the beginning, the organization emphasized absolute obedience to superiors. Questioning authority was framed as spiritual failure. This culture would later become the mechanism that enabled decades of abuse. The crimes began early. As early as the 1940s and 1950s, seminarians under Maciel's authority were sexually abused. Many were teenagers training for the priesthood, completely dependent on Maciel for their future within the church. He summoned them to private rooms, claimed he suffered from medical conditions, and demanded sexual acts under the guise of treatment or obedience. Victims were told that refusing would harm the mission of the church. Some were told their actions were spiritually necessary. Others were threatened with expulsion, disgrace, or divine punishment. Silence was enforced. The legionaries required members to take vows that explicitly forbade criticizing superiors. Reporting abuse outside the order was treated as betrayal. Victims who tried to speak internally were ignored, punished, or removed. Despite this, complaints reached the Vatican. By the 1950s, multiple reports accusing Maciel of sexual abuse and drug addiction were submitted to church authorities. An internal Vatican investigation briefly removed him from leadership in 1956, but the consequences were temporary. Within years, Maciel was reinstated. Not only reinstated, empowered, he resumed leadership of the Legionaries and expanded the order globally. He cultivated allies in Rome, presenting himself as fiercely loyal to the papacy at a time when the church was battling internal reform movements. His loyalty made him untouchable. The abuse continued. Over decades, Maciel assaulted seminarians across multiple countries. Later, revelations showed that he also abused minors and maintained secret relationships with women, fathering multiple children, some of whom he also abused. All of this occurred while he publicly preached morality, discipline, and obedience. In the 1990s, victims made another attempt. 8 former legionaries came forward with detailed testimonies and filed formal complaints with the Vatican. They provided names, dates, locations, and corroborating accounts. The accusations were credible and consistent. The response was silence. The Vatican did not open a public investigation. Maciel remained in power. In 2004, Pope John Paul II publicly praised him as an efficacious guide of youth, reinforcing his untouchable status. For victims, this was devastating. They watched as their abuser was celebrated by the institution that had heard their testimonies. Many retreated back into silence, convinced justice would never come. The turning point came only after a change in leadership. In 2006, under Pope Benedict XVI, the Vatican reopened the case. This time, the evidence could no longer be ignored. Maciel was found guilty by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, not through a public trial, but through internal church proceedings. The outcome was telling. Maciel was not arrested. He was not tried in a court of law. He was instructed to withdraw into a life of prayer and penance. No public acknowledgement of guilt was made at the time. No apology was issued to victims. He lived out his remaining years in seclusion. Marcial Maciel died in 2008, never having faced criminal prosecution. Only after his death did the full scale of his crimes become public. The Vatican released statements acknowledging that Maciel had lived a double life and committed very serious and objectively immoral behaviors. The Legionaries of Christ admitted institutional failures and announced reforms. If you follow real stories where faith and power collide, this channel is for you. But the damage was immeasurable. Victims spoke openly about decades of trauma, depression, addiction, shattered faith, and lives shaped by fear and silence. Many described the additional pain of watching Maciel protected by popes, cardinals, and Vatican officials, even after credible accusations were known. The legionaries faced investigations worldwide. Financial transparency collapsed. Membership declined. Trust evaporated. Yet no Vatican official who protected Maciel faced criminal consequences. The reflection is unavoidable. Marcial Maciel was not hidden. He was elevated. He was not ignored. He was defended. He was not unknown. He was protected because he was powerful, useful, and loyal to the institution that shielded him. This was not a failure of oversight. It was a failure of courage. When institutions protect those who bring influence and wealth, victims become collateral, and silence becomes policy. And in this case, silence lasted nearly 70 years. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. What part of this case shocked you the most? One day, the church doors closed. No explanation was ever given. This man was never questioned, because questioning him meant questioning God. For decades, Theodore McCarrick moved through the highest circles of the Catholic Church. He was not hidden in distant parishes or obscure ministries. He was a bishop, then an archbishop, then a cardinal, a public figure who represented the church on the world stage. He raised millions of dollars, advised popes, influenced appointments, and traveled internationally as a trusted emissary. To the public, he embodied authority. Too many within the church, rumors followed him quietly. And to those he abused, power was the weapon that ensured silence. McCarrick was ordained a priest in 1958 and rose steadily through the hierarchy. By the 1970s, he was already a prominent figure, praised for his charisma and fundraising ability. He worked closely with seminarians, young men training for the priesthood, often positioning himself as a mentor who could advance their careers. The setting mattered. Seminarians were dependent on bishops for recommendations, housing, and future assignments. Their entire vocational future rested on obedience and approval. McCarrick understood this imbalance intimately. The abuse did not begin with children alone. Multiple seminarians later described being invited to McCarrick's beach house in New Jersey. They were told sleeping arrangements were limited. McCarrick would insist that one seminarian sleep in his bed. Those who resisted feared consequences. Those who complied described unwanted sexual contact, coercion, and humiliation. If you follow real stories where faith and power collide, this channel is for you. The message was implicit but clear. Compliance meant favor. Refusal meant risk. At the same time, allegations existed involving minors. These reports were far less visible, buried under layers of confidentiality and deference. Complaints reached church officials over many years, often dismissed as rumors or quietly settled. McCarrick continued to rise. In 1986, he became Bishop of Met. In 2000, he was appointed Archbishop of Washington, D.C. Shortly after, he was elevated to Cardinal, one of the most powerful positions in the church. By then, church leadership had heard warnings. Internal reports, later released, showed that Vatican officials and U.S. bishops were aware of allegations of sexual misconduct with seminarians and young men. Settlements were paid. Non-disclosure agreements were signed. Restrictions were discussed, but rarely enforced. McCarrick was never reported to police. Instead, he was asked quietly to reduce public appearances. These requests were informal and uninformed. He continued to travel, speak, and represent the church internationally. The crimes continued in silence. For years, victims believed they were alone. Seminarians assumed their experiences were isolated. Minors believed no one would believe them, not against a cardinal with global influence. The wall began to crack in 2018. A credible allegation emerged involving a minor abused by McCarrick decades earlier. Unlike previous complaints, this one could not be quietly dismissed. An internal church investigation confirmed its credibility. Public disclosure followed. In June 2018, the Archdiocese of New York announced that McCarrick had been removed from public ministry. Weeks later, the Vatican took the unprecedented step of stripping him of his cardinal rank. The world reacted with shock. As media coverage intensified, more survivors came forward. Seminarians described decades-old abuse. Patterns emerged: coercion, manipulation, and retaliation against those who resisted. The question shifted rapidly. How did this happen for so long? The answer lay not in ignorance, but in protection. Investigations revealed that church leaders had repeatedly chosen institutional stability over accountability. McCarrick was considered too valuable, too connected, too influential to confront publicly. His ability to raise funds and navigate politics insulated him from scrutiny. Silence was not accidental. It was strategic. In 2019, the Vatican released a detailed report acknowledging failures at the highest levels. It confirmed that multiple popes and bishops had been aware of allegations but failed to act decisively. That admission came too late for victims. In 2021, Theodore McCarrick was charged in Massachusetts with sexually assaulting a minor in the 1970s. It was the first criminal case brought against him, although later dismissed due to his age and health. The charges marked a historic moment, the first time a former cardinal faced criminal prosecution for sexual abuse. Civil lawsuits followed in multiple states. Survivors spoke publicly about the damage inflicted not only by McCarrick, but by the system that empowered him. Many described lives shaped by fear, lost faith, and years of self-blame reinforced by silence. The aftermath rippled across the church. Policies were revised. Reporting mechanisms were introduced. Bishops promised transparency. But for many, these reforms felt hollow without consequences for those who enabled decades of abuse. No bishop who protected McCarrick faced criminal charges. The reflection is unavoidable. Theodore McCarrick was not protected because no one knew. He was protected because too many people did and chose not to act. His power did not come from secrecy alone. It came from status, influence, and an institution that equated scandal with sin, rather than crime with accountability. When authority becomes untouchable, abuse becomes inevitable. And when silence is rewarded, truth becomes dangerous. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. What part of this case shocked you the most? James Warren Jones was born on May 13, 1931, in Indiana, into a deeply fractured household marked by poverty, instability, and isolation. From an early age, Jones demonstrated an obsessive fascination with religion, death, and control. Neighbors later recalled him conducting mock funerals for animals, preaching to other children, and displaying an unsettling intensity well beyond his years. What appeared, at first, to be eccentric religiosity would later reveal itself as the foundation of one of the most catastrophic crimes committed by a religious leader in modern history. Jones became a Pentecostal preacher in the 1950s, founding what would eventually become known as the People's Temple. Publicly, the church promoted racial integration, social justice, and aid for the poor, messages that resonated deeply during a time of civil rights struggle in the United States. Jones positioned himself as a progressive pastor, welcoming black congregants, advocating equality, and offering tangible support like food programs and housing assistance. To many, he appeared to be a rare figure, a religious leader whose faith translated into real-world compassion. Behind the sermons, however, Jones cultivated absolute authority. He demanded loyalty not only to God, but to himself. Over time, church services shifted from biblical teaching to performances centered around Jones' supposed divine powers. He staged fake healings, manipulated followers into believing he could read minds, and encouraged public confessions designed to humiliate and control. Dissent was punished. Questioning Jones was framed as betrayal, not just of the church, but of humanity itself. As the People's Temple grew, Jones' paranoia intensified. He became obsessed with enemies, surveillance, and apocalyptic visions of persecution. He warned followers that the government, the media, and shadowy forces were plotting to destroy them. This fear-based messaging bound congregants closer to him, isolating them from friends, family, and outside perspectives. Members were encouraged to cut off non-believing relatives, surrender assets to the church, and relocate wherever Jones commanded. By the mid-1970s, mounting allegations of abuse, financial exploitation, and psychological coercion drew media attention. Former members spoke of beatings, forced labor, and sexual abuse carried out under the guise of spiritual discipline. Jones responded not with reform, but with flight. In 1977, he led hundreds of followers to a remote settlement in Guyana, South America, calling it Jonestown, a promised land where, he claimed, his congregation could live free from oppression. Jonestown was anything but a sanctuary. Surrounded by dense jungle and cut off from the outside world, the settlement became a closed system of control. Jones ruled through exhaustion, fear, and constant surveillance. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Loudspeakers blared Jones' sermons day and night. Food was rationed. Sleep deprivation was common. Punishments included public beatings and confinement. Children were separated from parents, raised communally, and taught to revere Jones as their ultimate authority. Violence was no longer symbolic, was operational. Jones conducted rehearsals he called White Nights, where members were ordered to drink liquids they were told were poisoned, as loyalty tests. These drills conditioned followers to accept death as obedience. Over time, Jones framed suicide as an act of revolutionary defiance, a noble escape from a cruel world that would never accept them. Concern from relatives in the United States escalated into political action. In November 1978, U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan traveled to Jonestown with journalists and family members to investigate allegations of abuse. Initially, the visit appeared calm. Smiling residents spoke on camera, insisting they were happy. But as the delegation prepared to leave, several members secretly begged to escape with them. Jones interpreted this as ultimate betrayal. On November 18, 1978, as Ryan and defectors boarded a small plane at a nearby airstrip, Jones' armed followers opened fire. Congressman Ryan was murdered along with 3 journalists and a defector. It was an unprecedented act of political violence ordered by a religious leader. What followed was even more horrific. Back at Jonestown, Jones gathered his followers and delivered what would become his final sermon. He told them the outside world would torture their children, enslave them, and destroy everything they stood for. Death, he insisted, was the only answer. Armed guards ensured compliance. Parents were ordered to poison their children first. Infants were injected with cyanide-laced liquid. Adults followed. Those who resisted were forced. By the end of the day, 918 people were dead, including over 300 children. It remains the largest mass murder-suicide in modern history. Jim Jones was found dead from a gunshot wound to the head widely believed to be The aftermath stunned the world. Images of bodies sprawled across the jungle shocked global audiences and shattered assumptions about religious safety, charisma, and trust. Survivors and investigators revealed the depth of psychological manipulation that had made such an atrocity possible. Jonestown was not the result of sudden madness, but of years of conditioning, fear, obedience, and normalized violence under a trusted spiritual authority. Families of victims were left with unbearable grief and unanswered questions. How could intelligent, compassionate people be led to such destruction? Psychologists later described Jones as a malignant narcissist with delusions of grandeur, but they also emphasized the role of environment, isolation, and systematic coercion. Jonestown became a case study in how unchecked religious power can escalate from emotional abuse to mass violence. Jim Jones did not begin as a murderer. He began as a preacher, one who spoke the language of justice and equality, who positioned himself as a moral guide. His story is a chilling reminder that the most dangerous leaders are often those who appear righteous, who cloak control in compassion and violence in faith. The legacy of Jonestown reshaped how governments, media, and religious institutions view cult dynamics and spiritual authority. Safeguarding laws, exit counseling, and public awareness campaigns emerged partly in response to this tragedy. Yet the core lesson remains timeless. When a leader claims divine authority over life and death, and when followers are taught that obedience is holiness, violence is never far behind. Jim Jones used the voice of God to justify the hands of violence, and nearly 1,000 people paid the price for believing him. What part of this case shocked you the most? The story of Benny Hinn is a revealing account of how immense influence, spiritual authority, and public trust can be exploited for personal wealth and comfort. Benny Hinn, known for his miracle crusades and televised healing services, built an empire that spanned decades, attracting millions of viewers and followers from around the world. 2 audiences. Hinn was a spiritual conduit, a man who could channel divine power, perform miraculous healings, and deliver tangible blessings to those willing to embrace faith. Yet beneath the spectacle of healing services and promises of prosperity lay a calculated system in which donations were solicited, trust was manipulated, and wealth was amassed, raising questions about the ethical limits of religious leadership. Hinn was born in 1952 in Jaffa, Israel, into a Greek Orthodox family, but he converted to Pentecostalism as a young man and quickly developed a reputation for spiritual fervor and public charisma. By the 1970s, he was traveling extensively, preaching revival meetings, and attracting a devoted following in North America. Hinn's early sermons emphasized faith, divine healing, and the power of God to transform lives, which resonated deeply with audiences seeking hope, relief from illness, and spiritual reassurance. His appeal was not merely theological but psychological. He instilled a sense of possibility, belonging, and empowerment, creating a loyal base of followers who believed his ministry was divinely sanctioned. The expansion of Benny Hinn ministries coincided with the rise of televangelism and the global reach of television networks. His miracle crusades were broadcast internationally, allowing Hinn to connect with millions of viewers, solicit donations, and cultivate a brand synonymous with divine healing and financial prosperity. He encouraged congregants to give generously, framing contributions as a spiritual act that would unlock God's blessings in their own lives. The theology of giving was deeply intertwined with the prosperity gospel. Donors were promised that their offerings would result in healing, protection, financial success, and favor. The messaging was powerful, emotionally compelling, and extremely effective in generating substantial revenue. By the 1990s, Hinn's ministry had grown into a multi-million-dollar operation, with revenue streams derived from televised donations, book sales, overseas tours, and merchandise associated with his teachings. Investigations later revealed the scale of Hinn's financial empire. Private jets, luxury homes, and opulent accommodations for himself and ministry staff were funded by donations from followers, who often contributed far beyond their means. Critics accused Hinn of exploiting faith to finance a lavish lifestyle, arguing that the spiritual and emotional manipulation of congregants was an integral part of his fundraising strategy. In public, Hinn maintained that the wealth was necessary to further God's work, but the disparity between the lives of donors and the luxury of the ministry raised ethical and legal concerns. The controversy surrounding Benny Hinn escalated in the early 2000s when investigative journalists, religious watchdog groups, and regulatory authorities began examining the financial practices of his ministry. Reports highlighted inconsistencies in accounting, potential misappropriation of funds, and extravagant expenditures that appeared unrelated to charitable or spiritual purposes. Critics argued that the accumulation of wealth by Hinn and his inner circle was disproportionate to the needs of the ministry's charitable or spiritual mission, suggesting a pattern in which public trust was leveraged for personal gain. The emotional and spiritual impact on followers was profound. Many individuals donated life savings or relied on Hinn's promises of divine intervention during desperate periods of illness, debt, or personal crisis. When miracles failed to materialize as promised, some followers experienced disillusionment, emotional distress, and a crisis of faith. The sense of betrayal was compounded by the realization that contributions intended to facilitate spiritual and communal good had instead funded a system designed to elevate the pastor's personal wealth and status. The resulting psychological trauma was widespread, affecting both individual believers and broader communities that had invested emotionally and financially in the ministry. Hinn faced public scrutiny on multiple fronts. In 2007, a U.S. Senate investigation into televangelists specifically questioned the financial practices of Hinn and other prominent ministries. The investigation sought to determine whether tax-exempt donations were being used appropriately, whether donors were misled regarding the purpose of their contributions, and whether oversight mechanisms were sufficient to prevent abuse. Although Hinn ultimately cooperated with authorities and maintained that he had not intentionally defrauded anyone, the publicity surrounding the investigation intensified criticism and exposed the vulnerability of followers who trusted him implicitly. The legal and regulatory attention also prompted introspection within religious communities. Scholars and theologians debated the ethical boundaries of prosperity gospel teachings, emphasizing the tension between encouraging generosity and exploiting faith for personal enrichment. Hinn's case became emblematic of the broader risks associated with charismatic leadership in unregulated or lightly regulated religious organizations. It illustrated how public influence, media reach, and personal charisma could be used to solicit funds on a massive scale while minimizing accountability. Beyond finances, Hinn's ministry also faced allegations of emotional and psychological manipulation. Attendees at his crusades described highly charged environments in which individuals were encouraged to surrender not only money, but personal autonomy and critical judgment in exchange for spiritual rewards. Hinn's rhetorical strategies created a sense of urgency, fear of divine disfavor, and moral obligation, further reinforcing the congregation's willingness to comply. This dynamic of authority and control, combined with the promise of miraculous outcomes, exemplified the ways in which power could be exercised under the guise of spiritual leadership. The aftermath of the scandal and public scrutiny did not end Hinn's influence, though it did alter public perception. He continued to travel, preach, and maintain a television presence, but the warnings to prospective donors and the heightened skepticism among religious communities created a more cautious environment. Followers who remained loyal often did so from personal conviction, selective interpretation of teachings, or belief in the transformative power of Hinn's services, while others distanced themselves entirely, disillusioned by what they perceived as the exploitation of trust for personal gain. The enduring lesson from Benny Hinn's story is the dual-edged nature of charisma and spiritual authority. Hinn promised healing, prosperity, and divine favor, but delivered a system in which faith was monetized. Personal loyalty was extracted, and donations were converted into personal wealth. For followers, the betrayal was not merely financial, it was existential, challenging deeply held beliefs about morality, trust, and the integrity of religious leadership. The story underscores the necessity of accountability, transparency, and ethical oversight in religious institutions, particularly those with large followings and significant financial inflows. For individuals affected, the psychological and emotional consequences were lasting. Many experienced difficulty reconciling their faith with the reality of Hinn's practices. Families struggled with the tension between devotion and critical evaluation, while communities faced the challenge of restoring trust and rebuilding spiritual cohesion. Hinn's rise and the eventual exposure of questionable practices serve as a cautionary tale, demonstrating that the pursuit of personal wealth, when cloaked in spiritual authority, can devastate both individual lives and collective trust in religious institutions. Ultimately, Benny Hinn's story is a stark reminder that when pastors choose money over morals, the cost is borne by those who placed their faith in them. The allure of prosperity gospel, charisma, and promises of divine intervention can mask the manipulation and exploitation that occur behind the scenes. Hinn's ministry illustrates the vulnerabilities inherent in systems that combine spiritual authority with financial solicitation, emphasizing the enduring need for vigilance, oversight, and ethical accountability in religious leadership. It is a lesson in trust, betrayal, and the fragile line between spiritual guidance and exploitation. The story of Robert Tilton is a disturbing account of a spiritual leader whose pursuit of wealth overshadowed every moral obligation to his followers. Robert Tilton, once a prominent televangelist in the 1980s and 1990s, rose to fame through his program Success in Life, which combined motivational preaching, televised prayers, and solicitation of donations with promises of divine blessing. Tilton's message resonated with millions of Americans who sought hope, financial security, and spiritual guidance. His sermons emphasized that God rewards faithfulness, obedience, and giving, particularly through financial contributions to the ministry. On the surface, Tilton appeared devoted to uplifting the faithful, but investigations revealed a calculated exploitation of trust, faith, and generosity. Tilton's early career reflected a combination of ambition, showmanship, and religious zeal. Born in 1946 in Texas, he began preaching in local churches and quickly demonstrated an ability to connect with audiences through both oratory and theatrics. By the late 1970s, he had transitioned to television, recognizing the immense potential of media to expand his ministry. His program Success in Life broadcast to millions of households nationwide, using compelling testimonials, inspirational messages, and personal appeals to solicit donations. Tilton's charisma, combined with the persuasive techniques of televised ministry, created a strong emotional bond between him and his viewers. Audiences felt personally connected to his message, believing that contributions would not only support the ministry, but also bring blessings into their own lives. Central to Tilton's financial strategy was the concept of seed faith giving. Viewers were encouraged to send money, often substantial amounts, to the ministry as a demonstration of faith. Tilton presented this practice as a way to activate divine favor. The more a believer gave, the greater the spiritual reward they would receive. Letters and phone calls were sent to donors, reinforcing the notion that financial contributions were spiritually essential. Testimonials from miracle recipients, often staged or exaggerated, were used to encourage compliance, creating an environment in which faith and financial giving were tightly intertwined. By the late 1980s, Tilton's ministry had grown into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Investigations later revealed that donations were being mismanaged, misappropriated, or diverted for personal benefit. Tilton personally benefited from extravagant salaries, luxurious housing, and high-cost production for his broadcasts, which included expensive trips, elaborate television sets, and lavish events. Critics argued that these expenditures were inconsistent with the claimed spiritual mission of the ministry and reflected a deliberate strategy to monetize trust and devotion. In effect, Tilton had turned acts of faith into a revenue-generating mechanism that enriched himself at the expense of his followers. The scandal surrounding Tilton's operations intensified in the early 1990s when investigative journalism exposed financial misconduct. ABC's Primetime Live conducted an extensive investigation, revealing that donation envelopes from viewers were being discarded or ignored. Even as Tilton publicly promised that each contribution would yield blessings, donors were misled to believe that their money was being used for charitable purposes, healing services, and ministry expansion, while a significant portion was diverted to fund Tilton's personal lifestyle. The reports painted a picture of systemic deception, highlighting the ways in which media influence, charisma, and religious authority had been leveraged to mislead millions. Tilton's response to the scandal was mixed. Publicly, he denied intentional wrongdoing, claiming that all contributions were used appropriately and that any discrepancies were administrative errors. Internally, however, legal documents and testimony revealed that the ministry had maintained an organizational culture in which financial transparency was minimal and accountability structures were weak. Employees and volunteers, many of whom were committed to the stated mission, were often unaware of how funds were being allocated, leaving donors vulnerable to exploitation. The emotional impact on followers was profound. Millions of Americans had invested not only money, but faith and hope in Tilton's ministry. Families who donated significant portions of their savings experienced financial hardship, while others felt spiritually betrayed by a leader they had trusted implicitly. The realization that the promises of divine blessing were often tied to manipulated or misrepresented contributions led to disillusionment, shame, and a crisis of faith for many. Religious scholars later cited Tilton's case as an example of the psychological and emotional consequences of exploiting spiritual authority for financial gain. Legal actions against Tilton included investigations by the Internal Revenue Service and other regulatory bodies, which sought to determine whether the ministry's tax-exempt status had been abused, and whether funds were being misappropriated. While Tilton faced civil suits and was required to restructure his ministry's financial operations, criminal charges were largely avoided, reflecting the challenges of prosecuting complex financial schemes within religious organizations. Nevertheless, the public exposure of Tilton's practices significantly damaged his reputation and the credibility of his ministry. Tilton's story also catalyzed broader discussions about accountability in religious institutions. Questions arose regarding the ethics of soliciting donations under the guise of spiritual obligation, the responsibility of televangelists to maintain financial transparency, and the mechanisms necessary to prevent the exploitation of vulnerable followers. His case illustrated the vulnerability of viewers who, motivated by faith and hope, were persuaded to contribute without full knowledge of how their donations would be used. It also highlighted the need for media literacy and regulatory oversight in contexts where religious authority intersects with financial solicitation. The long-term consequences of Tilton's actions extended beyond financial loss. Many followers reported enduring psychological distress, feelings of betrayal, and difficulty trusting religious leaders in the future. Communities that had supported success in life were forced to reconcile the public persona of a charismatic, devout pastor with the reality of manipulation and personal enrichment. The experience prompted reflection on the delicate balance between faith, obedience, and critical evaluation of leadership. Ultimately, Robert Tilton's story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers inherent when pastors choose money over morals. He promised spiritual guidance, divine blessings, and hope to millions, yet delivered exploitation, deception, and financial abuse. His legacy underscores the importance of ethical accountability, transparency, and vigilance in religious leadership. The emotional and spiritual damage experienced by followers highlights that the cost of betrayal in faith-based contexts is profound and multifaceted, touching both personal well-being and communal trust. The case of Robert Tilton demonstrates how charisma, media influence, and spiritual authority can be weaponized to extract resources from devoted followers. It is a stark reminder that leadership in faith contexts carries immense responsibility, and that moral compromise for financial gain can devastate lives in ways that resonate far beyond the immediate moment. The story challenges religious institutions, followers, and society to remain vigilant, demanding integrity, transparency, and ethical conduct from those who hold positions of spiritual power. For those who trusted Robert Tilton, the consequences were enduring: financial loss, spiritual disillusionment, and a deep sense of betrayal. Yet the lessons of his rise and fall continue to resonate, offering a powerful reminder of the vulnerability of trust, the seductive power of charisma, and the imperative that morality must never be sacrificed in pursuit of wealth. Tilton's story remains one of the most infamous examples of televangelist exploitation, illustrating the consequences when faith is commodified, and when pastors prioritize personal enrichment over ethical leadership. The story of Eddie Long is a harrowing example of how pastoral authority can be leveraged to exploit faith, finances, and trust. Eddie Long, a prominent bishop of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, rose to national attention as a charismatic spiritual leader with a congregation that swelled into tens of thousands. Known for his compelling sermons, magnetic presence, and promises of prosperity and spiritual guidance, Long cultivated a devoted following who placed deep trust in his leadership. Yet beneath the polished public image, allegations of financial manipulation, coercion, and abuse emerged, revealing a pattern in which the pursuit of wealth and control overshadowed moral responsibility. Eddie Long was born in 1953 in Charlotte, North Carolina, and his early life was marked by a strong commitment to religion and public service. He demonstrated exceptional speaking skills and quickly became involved in ministry work, eventually founding New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in the 1980s. From its early years, the church attracted a growing congregation, drawn to Long's energetic preaching, inspirational messaging, and focus on personal empowerment. His sermons often emphasized that faith, obedience, and financial contributions were pathways to spiritual and material blessings, framing giving as both a religious duty and a spiritual investment. Long's rise coincided with the proliferation of megachurches in the United States, which relied on media, charisma, and expansive congregations to expand influence and revenue. He leveraged television, print, and live events to reach thousands of followers, creating an image of a spiritual authority who could transform lives. Within the church, the culture reinforced loyalty to leadership, encouraging members to trust Long implicitly, submit to his guidance, and contribute financially in support of church initiatives. The combination of spiritual influence and media presence enabled Long to consolidate both authority and wealth, creating a system in which personal devotion was tied closely to material support. Financially, Eddie Long's ministry became a multi-million-dollar operation. Reports indicated that the church purchased luxury properties, maintained expensive vehicles, and funded high-cost projects under the guise of spiritual mission work. Followers were encouraged to give generously, often exceeding their means, with the understanding that their donations would yield divine favor and prosperity. Investigations later revealed that these contributions were frequently used to support Long's lavish lifestyle, as well as to consolidate power within the church hierarchy. The disparity between the spiritual promises offered to followers and the personal enrichment of Long became a focal point of criticism and controversy. The scandal surrounding Eddie Long escalated in 2010, when multiple young men came forward alleging sexual misconduct and coercion. These claims described a pattern of exploitation in which Long allegedly used his pastoral authority to manipulate vulnerable congregants, including offering mentorship and support in exchange for sexual acts. Although these allegations were eventually settled out of court, they exposed a disturbing dynamic in which trust, devotion, and faith were weaponized to serve the personal desires of a leader. The combination of financial control, spiritual authority, and coercive behavior revealed a deeply troubling exploitation of power. Public and media reactions were intense. News outlets covered the allegations, drawing national attention to the operations of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church and Long's personal conduct. Commentators debated the ethical responsibilities of religious leaders, highlighting the dangers of centralized authority, lack of oversight, and the potential for manipulation when followers' faith is unquestioned. For many congregants, the exposure of Long's misconduct was devastating, leaving them to grapple with feelings of betrayal, shame, and spiritual confusion. The emotional toll extended beyond the immediate allegations, affecting families and communities that had relied on Long's guidance and leadership for decades. Long's ministry had, for years, employed sophisticated messaging and persuasive techniques to cultivate loyalty and compliance. Sermons emphasizing obedience, divine reward, and the moral imperative of giving were paired with public displays of generosity, philanthropy, and spiritual influence. By projecting an image of moral authority and spiritual success, Long was able to reinforce trust among followers, making it more difficult for congregants to question financial and personal demands. This manipulation of perception underscores the power of charisma and public image in consolidating authority, particularly in religious settings where personal devotion is deeply intertwined with moral and spiritual guidance. The legal proceedings, settlements, and media scrutiny led to significant repercussions for Long's public image and ministry operations. While criminal charges were not pursued, civil settlements required substantial financial compensation to the accusers, reflecting the material and emotional dimensions of the harm caused. Church operations faced increased scrutiny, and the congregation was forced to confront the reality that the leadership they had trusted had engaged in unethical, coercive, and financially exploitative practices. The fallout illustrated the vulnerability of followers to manipulation when faith, obedience, and financial support are intertwined. Beyond the immediate legal and financial consequences, the scandal had lasting psychological and social effects. Many congregants reported struggling with disillusionment, loss of trust in religious institutions, and difficulty reconciling their faith with the reality of Long's actions. Families who had encouraged participation in church initiatives experienced internal conflict, feeling guilt or responsibility for supporting leadership that ultimately betrayed their trust. The broader community faced the challenge of re-establishing trust in spiritual leaders while addressing the financial and emotional damage incurred. The case of Eddie Long highlights the dangers inherent in centralized spiritual authority, particularly when combined with financial solicitation and limited oversight. His ability to leverage charisma, media influence, and religious devotion to accumulate wealth and manipulate followers underscores the vulnerability of congregants to exploitation. It also demonstrates the importance of transparency, accountability, and ethical leadership within religious institutions, where the stakes involve not only financial resources but the spiritual and emotional well-being of individuals. Ultimately, Eddie Long's story serves as a cautionary tale about the consequences of prioritizing personal enrichment and control over moral responsibility. Followers trusted him with their faith, their finances, and their personal lives, and in return, many experienced exploitation, betrayal, and harm. His rise and fall illuminate the complex dynamics of power, faith, and accountability in religious organizations and serve as a reminder that spiritual authority carries profound ethical obligations that must never be subordinated to personal ambition or gain. The enduring lesson is clear: when pastors choose money and control over morals, the cost is borne by those who invest their trust, devotion, and resources. Long's story demonstrates how faith can be manipulated, wealth can be amassed, and trust can be shattered when ethical boundaries are ignored. For communities, families, and individual believers, the narrative underscores the need for vigilance, critical evaluation, and accountability in religious leadership. The consequences of betrayal in such contexts are profound, affecting lives, communities, and the broader perception of faith-based institutions. Eddie Long's ministry may have promised guidance, prosperity, and spiritual growth, but it delivered manipulation, exploitation, and moral compromise. His legacy serves as a stark reminder that trust placed in spiritual leaders is sacred, and that ethical responsibility must never be sacrificed for personal gain, wealth, or power. For those who are deceived, the emotional, financial, and spiritual impact remains a powerful testament to the dangers of unbridled authority in religious contexts. The story of Paula White is an unsettling example of how spiritual authority can be leveraged for personal gain, and how the promise of divine favor can be converted into a tool for financial enrichment. Paula White, a high-profile prosperity gospel pastor and televangelist, rose to prominence in the 1990s and 2000s as a compelling speaker and spiritual advisor, later gaining national recognition as a spiritual consultant to political figures. Her ministry emphasized the idea that faith, obedience, and generous giving would bring tangible rewards from God, including financial blessings, health, and personal success. While her teachings attracted millions of followers worldwide, investigations and reports over the years raised serious questions about the use of donations, lavish spending, and the ethical boundaries of her ministry's financial practices. Born in 1966 in Tupelo, Mississippi, Paula White experienced a challenging childhood marked by poverty and familial instability. She discovered faith as a teenager and began preaching at local churches, demonstrating charisma, confidence, and a deep ability to connect with congregants. Her ministry quickly expanded through both church leadership roles and television broadcasting. White became known for her dynamic presence, inspirational messages, and the central promise of the prosperity gospel, that God would reward faithful and generous followers with material success. This message resonated deeply with those seeking hope, stability, and a sense of purpose, drawing a loyal base of congregants who trusted her guidance and leadership. White's ministry grew into a sprawling organization with multiple congregations, television programs, and global outreach efforts. Central to her financial strategy was the solicitation of donations framed as seed offerings, financial contributions that were portrayed as essential to unlocking God's blessings. Viewers and congregants were encouraged to give generously, often with the promise of specific returns, both spiritual and material. The approach was highly effective. Millions of dollars were raised annually, allowing the ministry to operate on a scale that included television production, event hosting, and international outreach. However, scrutiny arose when critics suggested that a significant portion of these funds was being diverted for personal enrichment, rather than charitable or spiritual purposes. Investigations into Paula White's finances revealed patterns of high-value property acquisitions, luxury travel, and personal expenditures that were funded by donations from followers. White reportedly owned multiple residences, used ministry funds to maintain a lavish lifestyle, and directed significant resources toward personal branding and media presence. While her supporters defended these expenditures as necessary to advance the ministry and reach more people, detractors argued that the disparity between the wealth of the pastor and the struggles of her followers demonstrated an exploitation of trust and faith. The ethical implications of such financial practices became a central point of public discussion, raising questions about the responsibilities of religious leaders toward their congregants. White's prominence increased when she became a spiritual advisor to political figures, a role that expanded her influence beyond traditional ministry channels. She was able to access a wider audience, receive national media attention, and further consolidate authority within faith-based communities. Yet the combination of political visibility and prosperity gospel messaging intensified scrutiny. Critics raised concerns about conflicts of interest, potential misrepresentation of donations, and the prioritization of personal visibility and influence over the spiritual and financial welfare of followers. The expansion of her platform illustrated how charisma, media presence, and perceived spiritual authority could be leveraged to attract significant resources and attention. The emotional and spiritual impact on followers was profound. Many individuals invested not only financially but emotionally, believing that their contributions would bring divine favor, personal blessings, and protection. When promises failed to materialize as anticipated, some followers experienced disappointment, disillusionment, and a crisis of faith. Others, witnessing the contrast between the luxury of White's lifestyle and their own financial struggles, reported feelings of betrayal and manipulation. The psychological toll of realizing that trust had been exploited highlighted the vulnerabilities of congregants who placed unwavering faith in charismatic leadership. Legal and financial scrutiny intensified in the 2000s and 2010s as non-profit watchdog groups, journalists, and critics examined the operations of Paula White Ministries. While no criminal charges were pursued, public and media scrutiny focused on the ethical and moral responsibilities of televangelists, the accountability mechanisms for donations, and the transparency of financial reporting. These investigations underscored the tension between freedom of religious expression and the need to protect followers from exploitation, particularly when donations are solicited under promises of divine reward. White's ministry also faced internal criticism from former employees and congregation members. Accounts described a culture in which dissent was discouraged, Questions about financial transparency were minimized, and leadership decisions were presented as divinely mandated. Followers who sought clarification or accountability were sometimes met with spiritual admonishment, reinforcing the dynamic in which obedience and financial support were tied closely to the perceived favor of God. This system of control allowed White to maintain authority, consolidate resources, and continue expanding her influence without significant internal resistance. The long-term consequences for followers were multifaceted. Financially, some donors experienced hardship after contributing substantial sums to the ministry. Emotionally and spiritually, the betrayal of trust led to disillusionment and, in some cases, a re-evaluation of religious beliefs. Communities that had embraced White's ministry faced the challenge of reconciling the public image of a devoted spiritual leader with the realities of financial mismanagement and exploitation. Scholars and theologians used the case as a lens to examine the risks inherent in prosperity gospel teachings, highlighting the potential for manipulation when spiritual authority is combined with financial solicitation. Ultimately, Paula White's story is a cautionary tale of how trust, faith, and devotion can be exploited when pastors prioritize personal wealth and public visibility over ethical responsibility. She promised divine favor, healing, and prosperity, but delivered financial manipulation and moral compromise. Her ministry serves as a powerful example of the dangers posed when spiritual authority is weaponized, and when followers' faith is monetized in ways that serve the personal ambitions of leaders. The enduring lesson from this scandal is the fragility of trust in religious leadership. Faithful followers can be manipulated when promises of divine reward are tied to financial contributions, creating a system in which obedience and giving are leveraged for personal gain. White's case underscores the critical need for transparency, accountability, and ethical conduct in religious organizations. The psychological, spiritual, and financial consequences of her actions demonstrate that the impact of such exploitation extends far beyond immediate donors, affecting families, communities, and the broader perception of faith-based institutions. For the millions who invested in Paula White's ministry, the experience was a profound betrayal. Donations meant to advance spiritual growth were redirected to personal wealth. Trust in spiritual leadership was undermined, and faith was shaken. Her story remains a compelling warning of the consequences when pastors choose money and influence over moral and ethical responsibility. The narrative challenges congregants, institutions, and society to remain vigilant, demanding integrity, accountability, and ethical leadership from those entrusted with guiding the spiritual lives. The story of Creflo exposes how one of America's most high-profile prosperity gospel pastors used his religious influence to amass extraordinary personal wealth, raising questions about ethics, accountability, and the exploitation of faith. Creflo, founder of World Changers Church International in Atlanta, Georgia, became internationally recognized for his charismatic preaching, television broadcasts, and teachings on the principles of prosperity gospel. Two followers, represented a spiritual authority capable of guiding them toward divine favor, success, and blessings. Yet the enormous wealth he accumulated over decades, including private jets, luxury homes, and extravagant lifestyles, sparked widespread criticism, highlighting the potential for abuse when religious leadership intersects with unchecked financial power. Born in 1962 in College Park, Georgia, Creflo grew up in modest circumstances. Early on, he displayed a keen interest in ministry and public speaking, eventually founding World Changers Church International in 1986. The church began as a small congregation, but quickly expanded under Dallas' charismatic leadership. He utilized television, radio, and public events to reach a broader audience, emphasizing that God rewards faithfulness, generosity, and obedience with material and spiritual abundance. Central to his message was the concept of seed faith giving, the idea that donations to the ministry would yield tangible blessings in the donor's life. By the 1990s and 2000s, ministry had become a multi-million-dollar operation. His television programs, including Creflo Ministries, aired globally, reaching millions of viewers. Donations poured in from congregants and television audiences who believed their contributions would unlock divine favor. While many followers experienced personal inspiration and community support, the revelations about personal wealth sparked controversy. Reports detailed his ownership of multiple luxury homes, high-end vehicles, and private aircraft, all funded through donations from followers who were often struggling financially. Critics argued that Dollar's lifestyle reflected a stark contradiction between his teachings of modest stewardship and the reality of personal extravagance. The controversy surrounding Creflo Dollar intensified in the mid-2000s when his ministry became the focus of media investigations. Questions were raised regarding the transparency of financial practices, the allocation of donations, and the ethical implications of soliciting large sums from followers while maintaining a lifestyle of immense wealth. In particular, the purchase of a $65 million Gulfstream G650 private jet in 2015 drew national attention and criticism. Dollar defended the purchase, asserting that it was necessary for ministry operations, but the public response highlighted the perception of moral compromise and exploitation of trust. Followers' emotional and spiritual investment in Dollar's ministry was profound. Many had donated significant portions of their income with the expectation that their contributions would not only support the church's mission, but also bring blessings, healing, and success into their own lives. The revelation that large sums were used to fund the pastor's personal lifestyle rather than community projects created feelings of betrayal, disillusionment, and spiritual confusion. Families reported internal conflict, struggling to reconcile devotion to a pastor who preached prosperity and faith with the reality of lavish personal spending. The ethical debate surrounding Dollar's ministry extended beyond media criticism. Religious scholars, financial watchdogs, and community leaders questioned the responsibility of spiritual leaders to maintain transparency and accountability in managing donations. The prominence of prosperity gospel teachings, coupled with Dollar's high-profile persona, illustrated the inherent risks of concentrated spiritual authority. When a single leader controls both messaging and finances, the potential for exploitation increases, and followers are particularly vulnerable to manipulation. Dollar's defense often rested on theological justification. He maintained that the wealth of the pastor could be used as a tool to expand ministry outreach, fund charitable initiatives, and inspire followers to embrace the principles of faith-based financial success. To supporters, Dollar's wealth was a sign of God's favor, a manifestation of the very prosperity he preached. To critics, however, it was a glaring example of moral compromise, the accumulation of wealth at the expense of followers' trust and financial security, cloaked in the language of spiritual necessity. The long-term impact of Dollar's ministry on followers has been complex. While some congregants continue to find inspiration, guidance, and community support through his church, others have distanced themselves, disillusioned by the disparity between promises of spiritual prosperity and the reality of personal enrichment. Studies of prosperity gospel ministries indicate that such discrepancies can create cognitive dissonance, causing individuals to question faith, personal judgment, and the legitimacy of religious institutions. The psychological and emotional consequences are often compounded when individuals invest significant resources, both material and spiritual, into a ministry that prioritizes leadership enrichment over communal well-being. The public scrutiny surrounding Creflo Dollar's ministry also prompted discussions about regulatory oversight, financial accountability, and ethical responsibilities in religious organizations. While religious freedom protects the right of spiritual leaders to teach and solicit donations, the case underscores the tension between legal authority, moral responsibility, and the protection of vulnerable followers. Financial disclosure, independent audits, and governance structures are critical safeguards to ensure that donations are used in accordance with stated purposes, particularly in organizations wielding immense influence and authority. Ultimately, Creflo Dollar's story serves as a cautionary tale about the intersection of faith, wealth, and ethical responsibility. The promise of prosperity, when tied to financial contributions, can become a tool for exploitation, particularly when accountability structures are weak and authority is concentrated. Followers who invest emotionally, financially, and spiritually may be vulnerable to manipulation, highlighting the need for vigilance and critical evaluation in religious contexts. Dollar's ministry, while providing spiritual guidance to many, also illustrates the potential for harm when pastors prioritize personal enrichment over the welfare of their congregants. The combination of charisma, media reach, and the theological framing of financial giving created a system in which trust was leveraged for personal gain. The emotional, financial, and spiritual consequences for followers underscore the gravity of such exploitation and the enduring need for accountability, transparency, and ethical leadership in faith-based organizations. In the end, the story of Creflo Dollar is a vivid example of how the pursuit of wealth and influence can compromise the prompt moral and ethical responsibilities of religious leaders. For those who placed their faith and finances in his hands, the experience was often transformative, but not always positively. While some found spiritual inspiration, others faced betrayal, disillusionment, and financial loss. The lessons are clear. Faith, trust, and devotion are sacred. And when pastors choose money over morals, the consequences ripple through the lives of countless followers, communities, and institutions that rely on integrity and ethical leadership. For more real-life crime stories that expose the hidden dangers behind positions of power and trust, subscribe to the channel and